Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight, we journey to the quiet streets of ancient Constantinople, where lanterns flicker on marble walls and the sea wind drifts through narrow alleys. The empire stands tall, its domes gleaming and its markets humming. Yet beneath the surface, faint currents of change stir. We walk gently through these corridors of time, noticing the steady footsteps of emperors, the soft rustle of parchment laws, and the low murmur of prayers rising under vast arches. So, before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if this brought you calm. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. The story of the plague of Justinian begins, rather fittingly, in a city that never truly slept, mostly because it couldn't. Constantinople in the 6th century was a metropolis of dizzying ambition, marble facades, and endless noise. It was the eastern capital of the Roman Empire, though by then people were calling it the Byzantine Empire, and its ruler, Emperor Justinian I, wanted nothing less than to restore the full glory of Rome. He had big plans, reconquering lost lands, rewriting the law, and building monuments that would make the old Caesars look lazy. The city itself was a study in contradictions. It sparkled in the sunlight with domes and spires, its harbors brimming with ships from every corner of the Mediterranean. But beneath that grandeur lay narrow alleys where sewage ran freely, rats thrived, and people lived elbow to elbow. The empire's wealth and its filth were in constant contact. One fed the other in a sort of uneasy partnership. Gold flowed in, grain flowed in, and with it came fleas. No one in the 6th century really understood what fleas were doing. Of course, people noticed them. Sure, they bit, they itched, but they didn't see them as messengers of catastrophe. They were just part of life, like bad wine or corrupt tax collectors. Yet these tiny creatures, living on the backs of equally unassuming rats, were about to reshape history in a way no army or emperor ever could. The year was around 504 CE, when ships began arriving in Constantinople, carrying grain from Egypt. Grain shipments were the empire's lifeline. Without them, the capital would starve. But nestled among the sacks of wheat and barley were stowaways, rats carrying fleas, infected with a bacterium we now know as Yersinia pestis. The name sounds oddly polite for something so vicious. Once it entered a city, it could move faster than any marching legion. At first, the sickness didn't seem extraordinary. People fell ill all the time. Malaria, dysentery, fevers that came and went. But this one was different. Victims developed fevers that burned like furnaces, their glands swelling into painful lumps in the armpits, neck, and groin. These lumps gave the disease its later name, bubonic plague. People could go from healthy to dying in a matter of days, and there was no clear pattern. The rich were just as vulnerable as the poor. Even the imperial palace, with its polished mosaics and perfumed courtyards, could not keep out the invisible enemy. Imagine the confusion. In a time before germ theory, people explained illness through miasmas, bad air, or divine punishment. Priests held processions, doctors prescribed poultices and leeches. Ordinary citizens tried charms or prayers. Some blamed foreigners, others blamed sins. The city, always noisy, now filled with the sound of wailing, carts creaking under the weight of corpses, and the endless tolling of church bells. Constantinople had seen riots, fires, even invasions, but this was something else entirely. The historian Procopius, who lived through it, left an account that reads like someone struggling to describe the unimaginable while maintaining a polite tone. He estimated that at the height of the outbreak, 10,000 people were dying in the city every day. Modern scholars suspect that number was exaggerated, but even half of it would be devastating. The government stopped functioning. Grain rotted in the harbors because there were no dock workers left to unload it. Judges, scribes, priests, guards, all were falling sick. Justinian himself caught the plague and nearly died, though he somehow recovered. His survival was seen by some as divine favor, by others as proof that heaven had a dark sense of humor. The dead piled up faster than they could be buried. The city ran out of burial sites. Mass graves were dug hastily, and when those filled, bodies were tossed into abandoned buildings or even the sea. The stench was said to hang over the city like a fog. People tried burning incense to mask it, but there wasn't enough myrrh in the empire to cover that smell. Even as Constantinople suffered, the disease spread outward along trade routes across the sea into the countryside. It followed merchants and soldiers, slipping quietly through ports and caravan stops. The empire's lifeblood, its trade, became its undoing. Egypt, Syria, Italy, North Africa, the Balkans, one by one, cities that had recently been reclaimed for the empire fell silent under the weight of death. It's easy, centuries later, to speak in large numbers, millions dead, provinces depopulated. But in human terms, it meant fields left unharvested, children without parents, markets without buyers. It meant the baker's oven going cold because there was no one left to knead the dough. In some villages, entire populations vanished, leaving behind only the sound of the wind through empty houses. When Justinian recovered from his illness, he found himself ruling a kingdom of ghosts. His great dream of restoring the Roman Empire was collapsing under the weight of loss. Wars in Italy dragged on without manpower or money. Tax revenues evaporated. The economy shrank. Even the grand building projects, like the magnificent Hagia Sophia, slowed as workers and artisans died or fled. The empire would survive, yes, but thinner, weaker, haunted. Procopius, never a fan of Justinian to begin with, described the emperor's persistence as almost delusional. Justinian continued to issue decrees, plan campaigns, and demand taxes, even when entire provinces were too devastated to respond. But what else could he do? Empires do not grieve. They continue, if only out of inertia. The plague itself didn't end so much as fade. After 2 years of horror, it loosened its grip on Constantinople. People crept back into the streets, looked around, and tried to pretend life could return to normal. But the disease wasn't gone. It lingered, reappearing in waves for 2 centuries. The Byzantine world would never fully recover its earlier strength. Modern historians estimate that the plague of Justinian killed perhaps 1/3 of the population of the Eastern Mediterranean, maybe 25 to 50 million people across the wider world. It's difficult to grasp. Numbers that large tend to lose meaning. But if we imagine the empire as a living body, the plague was not just an illness, it was an amputation. It cut away the strength that had allowed Justinian's Rome to stretch across continents. And yet, like a patient staggering from bed, the empire survived. Trade resumed, though haltingly. Peasants returned to the fields. Cities rebuilt themselves in smaller, quieter forms. The plague became something whispered about, a story to frighten children or warn the devout. People remembered the year the bodies filled the streets, but memory softened it, as memory often does. Life had to continue. even if no one could quite remember what normal used to mean. As centuries passed, the plague's presence in history books dwindled. Later generations would fixate on another pandemic, the Black Death of the 14th century, and forget that the same bacterium had already tested humanity once before. But in Justinian's day, it felt like the end of the world. And it's worth remembering that the empire had faced catastrophe before. Only a few years earlier, in 53, Constantinople had nearly burned itself to the ground during the Naka riots. Those riots started, improbably, over chariot racing, the Blues and the Greens. Two rival fan groups turned political, and the resulting chaos destroyed half the city. Tens of thousands died before Justinian's forces crushed the rebellion. Out of that ruin, Justinian had rebuilt. He ordered the construction of the Hagia Sophia, a church so immense and luminous that visitors said its dome seemed to hang from heaven by a chain of light. When the plague came, it undid that sense of triumph. No army to defeat, no wall to rebuild, no victory to claim. Just an invisible foe that ignored rank and architecture alike. Even the Hagia Sophia could not keep out a flea. If there was any comfort, it came in strange forms. Those who survived developed some resistance. A few monks and chroniclers interpreted the plague as a cleansing, a trial that would purify the faithful. Others saw it as evidence of the empire's fragility, proof that human grandeur could crumble overnight. And yet, through all this, Justinian kept governing. It's hard not to admire or pity that level of determination. He continued to send generals to Italy, continued to draft new laws. His legal code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, became the foundation for much of European law centuries later. Perhaps that's the strangest legacy of all. Amid the greatest health crisis of antiquity, Justinian's obsession with order produced something that would outlast him by millennia. One might imagine him in his palace, surrounded by clerks copying decrees, the air heavy with incense to mask the smell of decay drifting from the city below. Outside, the harbor quiet, ships bobbing listlessly, the city's famed crowds reduced to ghosts, and in that silence, perhaps the emperor's mind turning not to conquest, but to survival, though history rarely gives us the luxury of knowing for sure. In time, even Procopius's sharp quill dulled. The chronicler moved from outrage to weary observation. The plague, he noted, seemed to move by its own will, appearing one year, vanishing the next, as if to remind humanity that control is an illusion. He described fields overtaken by weeds, villages swallowed by forest. Nature was reclaiming what the empire had taken. By the late 540s, the worst had passed, but the scars remained on the land, on the people, and in the psyche of an empire that would never again trust its own strength completely. The golden age of Justinian was over, though the emperor himself would live on until 56-5. His reign began with fire and ended with pestilence. Yet somehow, the Byzantine state endured for nearly another 900 years. Survival, not glory, became its quiet talent. On the centuries that followed, chroniclers would still refer to the time of the pestilence as a dividing line. Before it, prosperity. After it, endurance. Civilization didn't collapse, it adapted, but it did so with a kind of exhausted wisdom, the knowledge that no amount of marble, law, or theology could fully protect a city from what crawled in the dark corners of its grain ships. The plague of Justinian, in the end, was not a single event, but a long shadow. And as that shadow stretched across continents, it would touch distant lands and unexpected lives. drifting now beyond Constantinople's marble walls. The plague moved as easily as a rumor on a market wind. Trade was both the empire's heartbeat and its bloodstream, and every heartbeat carried infection farther. The ports of Alexandria, Antioch, and Pelusium all had their turn. Each was a hub of commerce and faith, and each learned what silence sounded like when thousands of voices stopped at once. Egypt, with its fertile delta and massive grain production, was the empire's pantry. It was also, according to later records, one of the first places where the plague took root before spreading north. The Nile, so often seen as life itself, became a highway for death. Barges that once carried harvests to waiting ships now brought empty hope. By the time Constantinople's grain fleet sailed, the fleas had already made themselves comfortable among the cargo. The Byzantine administrative machine tried, at first, to respond with precision. Governors issued decrees forbidding price gouging and hoarding, as though the economy could be reasoned with while the population collapsed. But as entire districts emptied, coins lost meaning. The empire's famously intricate bureaucracy, a lattice of taxes, ledgers, and parchment, became a map of absences. Offices stood vacant. Scribes who once tallied harvests now filled out death lists. In the countryside, things looked different, but no less grim. Villages that had never seen an imperial official found themselves suddenly important because they were still breathing. Survivors from cities fled outward, hoping the open air would save them. Many carried the disease with them instead. Travelers described towns where the only living creatures were dogs and crows, carts abandoned mid-journey, markets half set up, fruit rotting where it fell. Some areas, almost inexplicably, suffered less. Perhaps it was isolation, or luck, or patterns of trade we'll never fully reconstruct. In those pockets of relative calm, the rhythm of life continued awkwardly. Priests still rang bells, farmers still sowed grain, though fewer hands tilled the soil. For a while it seemed as if the empire might simply become rural again, a scattering of self-sufficient communities rather than a cohesive whole. The army too was hollowed out. Justinian's grand campaigns in Italy and North Africa relied on steady recruitment and supply lines, both disintegrated. Soldiers died in barracks far from home, their armor growing cold. Garrisons meant to hold frontier fortresses dwindled to a handful of watchful men, often too weak to patrol. Even victories lost their savor. Retaking a city mattered little when no one was left to govern it. Still, Justinian's generals tried to carry on. Belisarius, the empire's most famous commander, had already faced mutiny, jealousy, and exile by imperial order. When the plague struck, his armies were exhausted. Yet even then, imperial orders arrived demanding more campaigns, more results. One can imagine Belisarius receiving those letters and setting them aside, perhaps realizing that no enemy was more effective than the invisible one already marching among them. The wider Mediterranean world, always interconnected, felt the shock in waves. In Italy, the Gothic wars slowed to a crawl. Famine followed plague, and famine brought its own quiet arithmetic. In Gaul, Frankish kingdoms that had barely heard of Justinian suddenly encountered the same mysterious sickness. The symptoms were consistent: fever, delirium, swelling, and death. But the timing varied as though the disease were choosing its route with leisurely malice. Across the sea, in the Persian Empire, reports trickled in of similar devastation. The Byzantine and Persian states had been enemies for generations, locked in endless cycles of war. Now both faced a mutual opponent they could neither negotiate with nor kill. There's something almost poetic in that. Two empires defined by rivalry, brought to the same frail humility by a flea. In later chronicles, scribes tried to explain the randomness. They said the air turned foul, or that comets heralded divine punishment. Others thought demons carried the illness, or that certain stars burned too brightly. Astrology had more authority than medicine, and most physicians found themselves helpless observers. The era's medical texts offered advice ranging from avoid bad smells to pray harder. Those who survived often did so for reasons beyond their understanding. Immunity, chance, or simple geography decided fates. Families found themselves divided by luck. A child who buried her parents might fall ill weeks later, or live to tell the story decades after. There are records of slaves inheriting entire estates because their masters died suddenly, of cities ruled by whoever happened to remain upright. Economic consequences reached absurd proportions. With so few workers, wages rose dramatically, though there were often no employers left to pay them. Land went uncultivated, grain prices soared, then collapsed when no one was left to buy. The government tried freezing prices, but enforcement was impossible when officials themselves were dying. In some regions, gold coins were melted for lack of trade, turned into church ornaments, or hoarded as useless keepsakes. Religion filled the vacuum where reason failed. Churches overflowed with those seeking comfort, until the congregations themselves became contagion sites. Processions wound through the streets, chanting for mercy. Relics were carried from town to town, believed to ward off death. Some claimed miracles, though survival often owed more to geography than holiness. And when prayers failed, despair followed swiftly. Reports describe people abandoning loved ones, convinced that caring for the sick meant joining them. Others, paradoxically, became more charitable, tending strangers when family was gone. The extremes of fear and compassion lived side by side. The empire's communication network, couriers, messengers, diplomats, became a rumor pipeline. Stories of entire provinces wiped out reached the capital weeks late, by which time the situation had already changed again. The emperor's decrees meant to project control drifted outward like bottled messages, arriving in cities where no one remained to read them. Meanwhile, nature quietly took advantage. Without constant cultivation, fields reverted to scrubland. Sheep and goats wandered freely. Wildflowers grew over old roads. Some historians later suggested that climate patterns shifted slightly because of the depopulation, forests reclaiming cleared land. It's hard to prove but easy to picture, a landscape slowly exhaling after centuries of human noise. Despite everything, the Byzantine Empire did not disappear. Its administrative skeleton, though fractured, still functioned in outline. Grain ships eventually resumed their voyages. Tax collectors returned, cautiously, as though afraid the heirs still remembered. Justinian, scarred but undeterred, began issuing edicts to repopulate deserted areas. He encouraged survivors to move, to remarry, to rebuild. Some of these orders bordered on the desperate, as if he could legislate life itself back into existence. Archaeologists today find traces of that uneven recovery. In some regions, urban centers shrank to half their previous size. Churches were rebuilt smaller, homes reused older materials. Coins from the mid-6th century become scarce, then reappear decades later, a material record of demographic collapse and rebirth. The pottery styles changed too, simpler, rougher, made by fewer hands. Civilization dimmed but did not go dark. The psychological toll, though, lingers in the records. Chroniclers describe an age of uncertainty, when even survival felt provisional. People feared the air itself. Travelers avoided strangers. The empire's optimism, so strong in Justinian's early years, gave way to a cautious realism. Grand visions of reconquest faded into the practical work of holding what remained. When modern historians call it the first pandemic, they mean more than just its scale. It was the first time disease truly behaved like a global traveler, crossing seas, adapting to climates, looping back in recurring waves. Genetic studies suggest that Yersinia pestis evolved new forms during this period, perhaps hitching rides along the Silk Road towards Central Asia, even reaching distant lands we seldom associate with Byzantium. For nearly 2 centuries, outbreaks recurred roughly every generation. Children grew up hearing stories of the sickness the way others might hear fairy tales. Each recurrence rekindled fear, but less surprise. Humanity was learning slowly that plagues were not punishments or portents. They were part of the natural world's own rhythm, inconveniently indifferent to human meaning. By the end of the 6th century, the empire that once dreamed of restoring Rome's glory was focused mainly on survival. Justinian's successors ruled a leaner state. Fortunes shifted toward the military and religious institutions that could still command loyalty. Monasteries became both spiritual refuges and repositories of knowledge, keeping alive not just scripture, but fragments of science and philosophy through the dark stretches ahead. It is tempting to see the plague of Justinian as an ending, a closing curtain on classical civilization. But in truth, it was a transformation. Out of its ruins grew the medieval world, smaller, more local, less confident, but adaptable. The dream of universal empire gave way to networks of faith and resilience. People rebuilt, not because they expected immortality, but because existence had to be filled somehow. In the quiet centuries that followed, travelers could still find inscriptions half buried in weeds, names of emperors and builders no one remembered clearly. The plague had humbled the narrative of human control, and what remained was simpler: villages, prayers, and endurance. And yet, even then, echoes of the old ambition survived. Byzantine scribes continued to copy Justinian's laws. His buildings still stood. His name still appeared in church mosaics. His empire had lost its breath, but not its heartbeat. The story of the plague, stretching across generations, would fade into background memory. A caution, a whisper in sermons, a shadow in chronicles. Until 8 centuries later, the same bacterium returned under another name to remind Europe once again that it had never truly left. As the 6th century turned into the 7th, the Byzantine Empire began to move through the long process of recovery. But even as new leaders ascended and the remaining infrastructure was patched together, a quiet dread lingered in the air. The plague had not just thinned the population, it had dulled the ambition that once pulsed through the empire's veins. It's often said that empires don't crumble all at once. They erode, like the slow erosion of stone by wind. The plague of Justinian had been the first gust. In its aftermath, Byzantium found itself focused less on grand conquest and more on holding together the tatters of its former glory. Justinian had passed away in 565, and his successors, though competent, lacked his drive or vision. The empire no longer had the resources to fight wars on multiple fronts. Instead, they focused inward, trying to re-establish order in a region that had been ravaged by both pestilence and instability. The emperor's dream of reconquering the lost lands of the West, like Italy and Spain, was put on hold indefinitely, and with it, went the last traces of the grand imperial ambition that had defined the earlier centuries. The loss of manpower was the most immediate consequence. Soldiers, artisans, farmers, merchants, all the vital cogs that kept the empire functioning, were simply gone. One of the most striking aspects of the plague was its democratic nature. It didn't discriminate between social classes, and as a result, entire families vanished from history. From the emperor's palace to the humble cottage, life was disrupted in a way that transcended political or economic power. There was no longer any guarantee of survival based on rank. The streets, once teeming with the noise of bustling markets and chatter, were eerily silent. The population decline also affected the cities in profound ways. Constantinople, while never quite empty, shrank noticeably. Its streets were quieter, its walls a little less crowded. And in this quieter, slower world, a more fragmented and localized society took shape. As cities emptied, the countryside began to fill with those who had no place else to go. Agriculture became more of a patchwork, with communities spread further apart, depending on each other for what little they could produce. The empire, as it slowly regained its footing, found itself retreating in many ways. Military campaigns were scaled back, fortifications along the borders grew stronger, but fewer soldiers were available to man them, and the plagues kept returning. Though the most catastrophic wave had passed, outbreaks were not uncommon. They were more like a distant rumble, something that could never be entirely ignored. Every year brought the possibility of another wave, though no one knew when or where it would strike. The empire, forced into a kind of quiet survival mode, had to adapt. The early medieval period in Byzantium saw a shift in focus away from grand conquest and expansion, and towards securing what was left. The army became more defensive. Formerly grand, imposing structures like the hippodrome and the public baths gradually fell into disrepair, victims of the declining population and the inability to maintain such lavish amenities. Even the great Hagia Sophia, though still standing as a testament to Justinian's ambition, would find itself increasingly detached from the empire's daily struggles. Its gleaming mosaics and lofty domes became more a symbol of a time long past, rather than an active center of imperial power. But perhaps most crucially, the plague of Justinian changed the way people viewed their own existence. In an empire that had once been known for its rigid hierarchies and impressive military conquests, the disease wiped away the illusion of invincibility. The sense of security that had come with the imperial mantle, the belief that the emperor and his administration could control all within their domain, shattered. The disease didn't respect authority, lineage, or wealth. It simply spread, erasing all traces of human effort and planning in its wake. In the face of these losses, religion played a central role in helping people cope. The Christian Church, already a powerful force in the empire, became even more important in the daily lives of survivors. As the empire's cities emptied and the land grew quieter, it was in the churches that people found solace, or at least a sense of purpose. Religious leaders stepped in to fill the gaps left by the faltering government. Monasteries, already centers of learning and care, grew in importance, and in the quiet of the monastic life, the memory of Justinian's grandeur faded into something less tangible, something more distant, less reachable. While the emperors of Byzantium continued to rule, their power was increasingly symbolic, bound by the shifting sands of time and circumstance. In the wake of the plague, the Byzantine Empire began to transform from a centralized imperial power into a more decentralized collection of provinces. each struggling with its own unique set of challenges. The imperial court, once the beating heart of Byzantine governance, became a place of more routine affairs, less grandiose and more pragmatic. And yet, despite these setbacks, Byzantium endured. It did not collapse under the weight of the plague, as many feared it might. The empire, while much smaller and more fragmented than in Justinian's time, continued to function, albeit on a reduced scale. The borders were less stable, and external threats began to loom larger. The rise of the Arab caliphates, the Slavic invasions, and the pressure from the Franks and Lombards would soon become new, even greater challenges. But the Byzantine Empire had learned to survive with less. It adapted to its circumstances, and in doing so, it stretched its existence into the centuries that would follow. For the people who lived through it, the plague of Justinian became a marker of history, a point of reflection and a reminder of just how fragile human existence can be. It wasn't just a medical event, it was a cultural turning point. It changed the way people thought about their own lives, the empire they belonged to, and their place in the world. It reshaped their understanding of power and mortality, and in doing so, it laid the groundwork for the next phase of Byzantine history. The plague's influence can still be seen today. The study of the disease itself, its origins, its impact on society, and its long-lasting effects on the Byzantine world, offers an enduring insight into the resilience of human societies in the face of catastrophe. It reminds us that empires are not immortal, no matter how grand their architecture or how bold their leaders. Even the mightiest of civilizations can be brought low by something as simple as a flea, and it's in the aftermath of such calamities that history often finds its most profound lessons. In the centuries to come, the legacy of the plague of Justinian would be woven into the stories told by historians, chroniclers, and religious scholars. Its impact would echo through the rise and fall of empires, the shifting of borders, and the ever-changing relationship between human beings and the forces of nature. It is not just an event to be remembered for its death toll, but for the way it changed the course of history itself. As the Byzantine Empire staggered through the post-plague years, the world outside its walls began to change. The plague, though it had crippled the heart of the empire, did not take all of civilization with it. The world continued to turn, albeit a little slower, a little more cautiously. Empires and kingdoms that had once been distant on the edge of Byzantine awareness began to rise in strength and prominence. And as the Byzantines struggled with their own internal decay, new powers would emerge to challenge them, some perhaps unknowingly, rising from the very same seeds that Justinian had sown. One of the first and most significant shifts was the rise of Islam. In the century after the plague of Justinian, the Middle East, once a relatively stable region under the Sasanian Empire, found itself overtaken by the forces of the Prophet Muhammad and his successors. By the time of his death in 6032, the Arabian Peninsula had been united under the banner of Islam. The rapid expansion of the Muslim caliphates into the Byzantine and Sasanian territories would bring about one of the most profound shifts in world history. For the Byzantine Empire, this was nothing short of a catastrophe. The Arabs, with their lightning-fast armies, pushed deep into Byzantine lands. Egypt, once a jewel in the Byzantine crown, fell to the Muslims in 61. The loss of Egypt was catastrophic, as it had been the breadbasket of the empire. The empire's ability to feed its cities, especially Constantinople, was severely compromised. The same grain shipments that had kept the imperial capital alive for centuries were now in the hands of their enemies. The loss of Egypt marked a turning point in the empire's fortunes, and from that point on, the Byzantines were never able to fully recover their former power in the region. While the Byzantine Empire scrambled to hold on to what remained, the caliphates continued to expand. The early Islamic expansion did not just consist of military victories. It was a cultural revolution too. The Arabs brought with them not only their faith, but also their knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. They turned former Byzantine cities like Alexandria and Damascus into centers of learning and innovation. Meanwhile, the Byzantines were struggling with their own internal difficulties. The religious and intellectual legacy of the ancient world, long preserved in Byzantine monasteries and libraries, was now under threat from a new aggressive force. What remained of the old learning was scattered, hidden in pockets of resistance. The great libraries of Alexandria and Antioch, once home to the writings of Aristotle and Galen, were lost to time, their texts either burned or forgotten. The Byzantines, even as they clung to their religion, found themselves outpaced in intellectual innovation by their new Islamic neighbors. Despite the military losses, the Byzantine Empire did not entirely fall apart. The imperial capital, Constantinople, stood strong, its walls impregnable to the sieges that the Arabs tried to lay against them. The famous Theodosian walls, which had protected the city for centuries, proved their worth once again. In the face of military setbacks, the Byzantines focused on defense and recovery. The empire, no longer the expansive force it once was, settled into a defensive posture, fending off invaders and trying to maintain the remnants of its old glory. However, while the Byzantines were preoccupied with the threat from the east, new challenges emerged in the west. The Lombards, a Germanic tribe, had already begun their encroachment in northern Italy in the late 6th century, and by the middle of the 7th century, they had established themselves as a major force. The loss of northern Italy was another blow to Byzantine ambitions. The popes in Rome no longer looked to Constantinople for leadership. The relationship between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church had already been strained, but the Lombard invasions accelerated the divide. The popes, seeking protection from the Lombards, eventually turned to the Franks for aid. The Franks, led by Charles Martel, were rising to power in Western Europe. Charles Martel's victory at the Battle of Tours in 73, where he repelled the advancing Muslim forces, cemented his reputation as a defender of Christendom. But what had hard as a defense of the Western world soon became an opportunity for the Franks to carve out their own empire. In 800, Charlemagne, Martel's grandson, would be crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope, formally splitting the old Roman Empire into two halves, the Byzantine East and the Frankish West. The Pope, once a humble religious leader in the Byzantine orbit, now found himself at the center of a new political power in the West, one that would challenge Byzantine authority for centuries to come. For Byzantium, this marked the beginning of a slow but inexorable decline in influence. Where once the emperor in Constantinople had been the undisputed ruler of all Christendom, now there was a competing Christian kingdom in the West, with its own pope and its own ambitions. The papal states would grow, and the Church in Rome would continue to exert its power over the political affairs of Europe, leaving the Byzantines with fewer and fewer allies in the Christian world. The schism between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, which had been growing since the early Middle Ages, would deepen, with the papacy and the emperor's court becoming increasingly antagonistic toward one another. By the time of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, centuries later, the tension would boil over. But even before that, the writing was on the wall. The Byzantine Empire's hold over its territories had weakened irreparably, and the rise of these new powers was an unmistakable sign that the old order was gone. What had once been the center of the world, the Byzantine Empire, was now merely a relic of a bygone age. Yet, even as the empire shrank, something extraordinary happened. The Eastern Orthodox Church began to thrive, not just in Byzantium, but in the Slavic lands. The missionaries Cyril and Methodius, sent by the Byzantine emperor, helped spread Christianity to the Slavs, converting large portions of the population to orthodoxy. As the empire's borders shrank, its religious influence spread outward, laying the groundwork for the establishment of the Russian Orthodox Church. In Russia, the Byzantine influence continued to linger, even as the Byzantine Empire itself faded into history. The city of Kiev, a flourishing center of trade and culture, looked to Constantinople for its religious and cultural direction. When the Mongols invaded and destroyed Kiev in the 13th century, the Russians found their new capital in Moscow, and with that move, Moscow would eventually claim the mantle of the Third Rome, a spiritual successor to Constantinople, preserving Byzantine traditions long after the empire's fall. The Byzantine Empire, though fractured, became a symbol. It lived on in the arts, in religion, and in memory. The legacy of Justinian, the Hagia Sophia, the preservation of Roman law, and the very idea of empire carried on, scattered across the earth, like the seeds of a once great tree. Though the empire was lost to time, it never disappeared entirely. It lingered in the heart of the East, in the faith of the Orthodox Christians, and in the cultural ties between the West and the remnants of Rome. The legacy of Byzantium, shaped by tragedy, resilience, and transformation, would continue to influence the course of history long after the final chapter was written. By the turn of the 9th century, the Byzantine Empire, once the proud inheritor of Roman power, had become a shadow of its former self. Yet, despite its diminishing territory and influence, it had not disappeared entirely. Instead, the Byzantine world began to change in subtle ways, adapting, evolving, and quietly contributing to the world's future in ways that would only be appreciated centuries later. As the empire's borders shrank, so too did its influence over trade and politics. The great Mediterranean heart of the empire was now pierced by the presence of new kingdoms and powers, the rise of the caliphates, the constant threat of the Lombards in Italy, and the ongoing instability in the Balkans meant that Byzantium's former imperial strength was no longer a given, but it had one strength that could never be fully diminished: its cultural and religious legacy. The 7th and 8th centuries were a time of transformation in Byzantine religion. With the rise of Islam in the East and the continued power of the papacy in the West, the Eastern Orthodox Church found itself at the center of a spiritual and cultural tug-of-war. It was during these centuries that the theological, political, and cultural foundations of the empire began to shift. The tension between the Pope in Rome and the Emperor in Constantinople continued to grow. The Pope, with his increasing influence in Western Europe, began to look more and more to the West for alliances, further solidifying the division between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. Meanwhile, the Eastern Orthodox Church, in its long history of grappling with theological questions, increasingly became a unique cultural and religious institution, less and less concerned with the politics of empire and more focused on the spiritual and intellectual preservation of its traditions. Perhaps the most dramatic example of this shift occurred during the reign of Emperor Leo III, who introduced the controversial policy of iconoclasm in the early 8th century. Leo, in his attempt to cleanse the church of idolatry, ordered the destruction of religious icons. The debate over the role of images in worship had been simmering for centuries, but it reached a fever pitch under his rule. The iconoclasts, or those who supported the destruction of icons, argued that religious images were a violation of the commandment against idolatry. They believed that worshipping icons was a form of false worship, a dangerous step away from true Christian faith. But those who supported the veneration of icons, known as iconophiles, argued that icons were not idols but sacred objects that helped bring people closer to the divine. This theological rift plunged the Byzantine Empire into a period of internal strife, with church and state at odds. The conflict did not end with Leo's death, but it marked the beginning of a slow, steady shift in the empire's religious landscape. The iconoclasts lost the battle in the long term, and icons were eventually reinstated as an integral part of Orthodox worship. Yet, the iconoclastic controversy had profound effects on the religious and political landscape of Byzantium. It weakened the emperor's authority over the church, further driving a wedge between the eastern and western branches of Christianity. Despite the decline of the Byzantine Empire's territorial holdings and political dominance, its intellectual and cultural influence did not falter. It was during this period that Byzantine scholars continued to preserve and copy the great works of classical antiquity, often in a very literal sense. The works of Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, Roman historians, and mathematicians were meticulously copied by Byzantine scribes, many of whom were based in the empire's great monasteries. These texts, preserved in Byzantine libraries, would eventually make their way to the West, first through the Islamic world and later through the Renaissance, where they would help fuel a rebirth of interest in classical ideas. In fact, the preservation of knowledge during the Byzantine Empire's twilight years cannot be overstated. The monks of the empire, often working in isolation and away from the noise of the political world, played a crucial role in keeping the flame of classical knowledge alive. The Greek language, long relegated to the fringes of the Western world, continued to thrive within the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine scholars not only kept the classics alive, but also engaged in new intellectual endeavors, making advances in theology, law, and philosophy that would later influence the West. One of the most significant legacies of this period is the Corpus Juris Civilis, or the body of civil law, a collection of laws compiled by Emperor Justinian I in the 6th century. Though Justinian's empire had already been dealt a severe blow by the plague and external invasions, his legal reforms endured long after his death. The Corpus Juris Civilis became the foundation of law in much of Europe, especially as the Western world began to experience a renewed interest in Roman law during the Renaissance. In the Byzantine Empire, however, it continued to serve as the basis of imperial law for centuries. The legal concepts contained within the Corpus Juris Civilis formed the backbone of many legal systems in Europe, influencing the development of Western law in profound ways. And so, in the years after the plague of Justinian and the decline of the empire's military power, Byzantium found its place as a custodian of knowledge, a defender of the faith, and a silent yet enduring influence on the culture of Europe. The Byzantine Empire may have been retreating politically, but its contributions to art, architecture, and intellectual life remained a vital part of the world's history. On the artistic side, Byzantium continued to produce some of the most breathtaking works of art in the medieval world. The famous mosaics of the Hagia Sophia and other Byzantine churches have endured for over 1,000 years, still gleaming in their golden brilliance. These mosaics, which depict saints, emperors, and biblical scenes, represent a unique blend of Christian iconography and classical Greek and Roman artistic traditions. In their radiant colors and intricate designs, these works of art became a defining feature of Byzantine culture. The architecture of the Byzantine Empire also continued to influence the world. Long after the empire's decline, the domed churches of Constantinople, with their soaring arches and intricate designs, inspired the architecture of later Christian churches, particularly in Russia and Eastern Europe. The use of the dome in church architecture would become a hallmark of Orthodox Christianity, spreading beyond Byzantium's borders into regions that were once part of the empire. But even as these intellectual and artistic achievements endured, the Byzantine Empire itself began to fade further into the background. The rise of the Ottoman Empire, the Mongol invasions, and the eventual fall of Constantinople in 1453 marked the final end of the Byzantine Empire. The Ottomans, with their powerful armies and vast resources, would finally conquer the once impervious city, bringing to a close 1,000 years of Byzantine history. Still, the Byzantine Empire's legacy would never fully disappear. Its intellectual contributions, its art, and its religious traditions would continue to influence the world for centuries to come. The Orthodox Church, having weathered the storms of iconoclasm and political upheaval, would continue to thrive in Eastern Europe, particularly in Russia, where the idea of Byzantium as the Third Rome took root. Even after the fall of Constantinople, the echoes of the Byzantine Empire's grandeur and its intellectual legacy would be heard in the intellectual and artistic achievements of the Renaissance and beyond. The empire that once dreamed of restoring the grandeur of Rome had, in the end, transformed into something entirely different. It had passed its cultural torch to the world, quietly, subtly, but with lasting influence. Byzantium may have faded from the map, but its legacy carried on through its people, its faith, and its scholarship, continued to shape the world in ways that even the empire's greatest rulers could not have imagined. As the 15th century unfolded, the Byzantine Empire found itself cornered. Once a powerful and dynamic state, now it was reduced to a shadow of its former self. Constantinople, the great city at the heart of the empire, was encircled by enemies on all sides, its walls no longer the symbol of invincibility they had once been. The empire, after centuries of decline, was now staring down the barrel of its final day. By this time, the Ottoman Empire had risen to power. The Ottomans, who had been expanding steadily into the Balkans and Anatolia, saw the last vestiges of the Byzantine Empire as a major obstacle to their ambitions. Constantinople, strategically located on the Bosporus, was a prize both for its symbolic significance as the capital of the Christian East and its immense strategic value. Whoever controlled Constantinople controlled access between Europe and Asia, the gateway between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. The Ottomans, under the leadership of Sultan Mehmed II, had already taken much of the Byzantine Empire's territory. Only Constantinople, the crown jewel, remained. Constantinople, now a city of roughly 50,000 people, was no longer the bustling metropolis it once was. Its walls, while still formidable, had aged. The grand church of Hagia Sophia, once the greatest cathedral in the Christian world, had fallen silent. The city was still a place of cultural and religious significance, but its political importance had dwindled. The Byzantine court was weakened by internal strife, and the nobility was divided, often more concerned with their own power struggles than with the survival of the empire. The plague had come and gone, leaving scars not only on the population, but also on the psyche of the Byzantine people. Mehmed II, known as Mehmed the Conqueror, had his eyes firmly set on the city when he laid siege to Constantinople. In April 1453, he brought with him one of the largest and most formidable armies the world had ever seen. The Ottomans had already conquered much of the region, and by this point had developed a military machine capable of laying waste to even the most entrenched fortifications. But it was not just numbers that made Mehmed's army so dangerous. It was his strategic genius. The defenders of Constantinople, led by Emperor Constantine Elephant Palaiologos, were hopelessly outmatched. The Byzantine Empire, already weakened by centuries of internal divisions and external pressures, could only muster a small force of soldiers and mercenaries. The city's famous Theodosian walls, which had once repelled invaders from all over the world, were no longer enough to withstand the might of the Ottoman artillery. Mehmed's troops rounded the city, cutting off all supply lines and starving the inhabitants into submission. And as the siege stretched on, the Ottomans brought their most powerful weapon to bear, enormous cannons capable of breaking through the thick walls of Constantinople. The defenders fought valiantly. The Byzantine soldiers, aided by a handful of European mercenaries and a few defenders from the surrounding Greek Orthodox communities, held their ground against the Ottomans. Yet despite their best efforts, the siege seemed hopeless. As the Ottomans continued to pound the walls with their massive cannons, cracks began to appear. The defenders, no matter how courageous, were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the attack. Throughout the siege, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos remained in the city, refusing to leave, even when there were whispers that he should abandon the capital and save his life. His decision was an act of defiance, a final effort to hold on to the last remnants of the Roman Empire. His people, though desperate, admired him for his resolve, but the reality was unavoidable. Constantinople's fate was sealed. On May 29th, 1453, after nearly 2 months of intense bombardment, the walls of Constantinople finally gave way. The Ottomans breached the city, and the final assault began. The defenders fought desperately, but the city was too far gone. The fall of Constantinople was swift and brutal. As Mehmed's forces poured into the city, the streets became choked with smoke and chaos. Many of the inhabitants, exhausted from weeks of siege, could do little to defend themselves. The conquest was violent. The Ottomans, as was customary in their military strategy, looted the city. But even in the midst of this destruction, Mehmed showed remarkable restraint. He spared the lives of many civilians, and when he entered the Hagia Sophia, he ordered it to be converted into a mosque rather than destroyed. This act, while a symbol of Ottoman victory, also marked the transformation of the city into the new capital of the Ottoman Empire, which would go on to shape the course of history for centuries. For the Byzantine Empire, the fall of Constantinople was the final blow. It had been a slow death, decades of war, disease, and economic collapse. But in the end, it was the Ottoman assault that brought it to an end. The once mighty empire, which had stood at the crossroads of Europe and Asia for over 1,000 years, was no more. The name Byzantine itself would be a term coined by later historians to describe a civilization that had, in its time, been so much more than just a relic of the Roman Empire. It had been a vibrant, living entity, one that had survived invasions, plagues, and wars. But in 1453, the world said its final goodbye to the Byzantine Empire. Yet, the legacy of the Byzantines did not vanish with the fall of Constantinople. The knowledge, culture, and faith that had been preserved for centuries in the Byzantine world would survive, carried westward into the Renaissance. The rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts, many of which had been carefully preserved by Byzantine scholars, ignited a cultural revolution in Italy and beyond. The Renaissance would not have been possible without the Byzantines' preservation of ancient knowledge. The Byzantine Empire's religious influence also endured. The Orthodox Church, having weathered the trials of the Byzantine Empire's decline, continued to thrive in Eastern Europe, especially in Russia. The idea of Constantinople as the Third Rome would eventually take root in Moscow, which saw itself as the successor to the great Byzantine tradition. The Russian Orthodox Church, firmly rooted in Byzantine practices and theology, would become the dominant faith in the region for centuries to come. The Ottomans, for all their military prowess, did not completely erase the legacy of Byzantium. In fact, they inherited much from their predecessors. The city's famous architecture, the religious traditions, and even the administrative systems of Byzantium were adapted by the Ottomans. Mehmed II, in his conquest, had unknowingly taken on the mantle of a great empire that had influenced the course of history in ways even he could not have foreseen. And so, the story of Byzantium, while ending in tragedy and conquest, lived on in unexpected ways. The fall of Constantinople may have marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, but its influence on the world continued to ripple outward, shaping the course of history in ways that stretched far beyond the walls of the city. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was a cataclysmic event that marked the end of an era for the Byzantine Empire, but it also heralded the rise of a new and powerful force in world history, the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, under Sultan Mehmed II, inherited the legacy of Byzantium, but they also reshaped the city and the region in profound ways that would leave a lasting imprint on history. The transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul was symbolic of the larger changes that swept through the region in the wake of the empire's collapse. When Mehmed entered the city, it was still reeling from the devastation of the siege. The once glorious capital of the Byzantine world was a shadow of its former self. But even in its ruins, there was potential. The Ottomans understood that they had inherited not just the city, but the intellectual, cultural, and artistic pulse of a region that had been at the center of the world for over 1,000 years. Constantinople's strategic location, at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, made it an ideal capital for an empire that was about to expand its influence over much of the known world. Mehmed's first task was to rebuild the city, and he did so with a blend of reverence for its past and a vision for its future. The Hagia Sophia, the architectural marvel that had symbolized Byzantine greatness, was converted into a mosque, a move that both preserved its grandeur and marked the Ottoman conquest of the city. This symbolic act tied the Ottomans not only to the legacy of Byzantium, but also to the broader Islamic world. Istanbul, once the center of Christendom, would now become the center of the Islamic world, a shift that reverberated through the centuries. Under Mehmed and his successors, the Ottomans set about transforming Constantinople into a thriving metropolis once again. They encouraged the migration of artisans, scholars, and merchants from all over the empire and beyond. The city's markets became bustling hubs of trade, as goods from the Far East, Africa, and Europe flowed through Istanbul's ports. The Ottomans also made sure to preserve the city's rich cultural heritage. Many of the Byzantine structures that had survived the siege were restored and repurposed. The Ottomans, inheriting the knowledge of the Byzantines, continued to build monumental architecture that reflected both their Islamic faith and the legacy of their predecessors. Yet, the Ottomans also made their mark in ways that went beyond architecture. They were keenly aware of the political and cultural importance of Constantinople, and they made sure to solidify their control over the region. The transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul was not just a matter of rebuilding buildings, it was about reshaping the cultural and political landscape of the entire region. The city became the heart of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans, for the first time, controlled the crucial trade routes that connected the East and West. As the Ottomans expanded their territory, their reach grew far beyond the borders of the Byzantine Empire. They moved into the Balkans, conquered much of the Middle East, and eventually took North Africa. The Ottomans created an empire that spanned 3 continents, and at its height it was one of the most powerful and prosperous empires in the world. They continued many of the administrative and legal traditions of Byzantium, particularly in terms of centralizing power in the hands of the Sultan and his viziers. The Ottoman system of government was highly organized, and the empire's military, particularly its elite Janissary corps, became a formidable force that helped the Ottomans maintain control over their vast territories. But while the Ottomans expanded their empire and thrived, they were also deeply influenced by the remnants of the Byzantine world. The Ottomans inherited much of the Byzantine intellectual legacy, including its artistic traditions, its knowledge of architecture, and its legal system. The Ottomans were particularly influenced by Byzantine art and architecture, and this influence can be seen in many of their most famous buildings, including the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, which bears a striking resemblance to the Hagia Sophia. The legacy of the Byzantine Empire was also preserved in the Ottomans' relationship with the Orthodox Church. After the fall of Constantinople, the Orthodox Christian community remained an important part of Ottoman society. The Ottomans allowed the Orthodox Church to continue its religious practices and even gave it a degree of autonomy under the leadership of the Patriarch of Constantinople. This arrangement allowed the Orthodox community to survive under Ottoman rule, and it created a kind of coexistence between Islam and Christianity in the empire. As the centuries passed, the Ottoman Empire continued to evolve, and its connection to the Byzantine legacy became more complex. The empire's power gradually began to wane, and by the 19th century, the Ottomans found themselves facing new challenges. The empire was no longer the sprawling, invincible force it had once been. European powers like Britain, France, and Russia began to assert their influence in the region, and nationalist movements within the empire's diverse population began to challenge Ottoman authority. The decline of the Ottoman Empire, much like the decline of the Byzantine Empire before it, was marked by internal divisions, external pressures, and the slow erosion of imperial power. Despite its eventual collapse in the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire's influence on the modern world is undeniable. The legacy of Byzantium, transmitted through the Ottomans, can still be seen in many aspects of modern Turkey, particularly in the city of Istanbul. The Hagia Sophia, which had served as a symbol of both Byzantine and Ottoman power, stands today as a monument to the long and complex history of the city. Though it has changed from a church to a mosque and back to a museum, it remains a living testament to the cultural and religious confluence that characterized the Byzantine and Ottoman worlds. Moreover, the Ottoman Empire's impact on the regions it ruled, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, continues to be felt in the political and cultural dynamics of these areas today. The empire's legal system, military structure, and administrative practices all left an indelible mark on the world, shaping the borders, societies, and governments of modern nations. In many ways, the fall of Constantinople and the rise of the Ottoman Empire marked the end of the Byzantine world, but the beginning of a new phase of history in which the legacy of Byzantium lived on. The Ottomans were not just conquerors, they were also heirs to the Byzantine Empire, inheriting its knowledge, traditions, and architectural grandeur. The story of Constantinople's fall, then, is not just the story of the end of one empire, but of the birth of another, a birth that would go on to shape the modern world in ways that continue to resonate today. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was not simply the collapse of an empire. It marked a transformation in the cultural, intellectual, and geopolitical landscapes of the world. In the centuries that followed, the Byzantine Empire's influence lived on in various ways through its intellectual achievements, its religious traditions, and its enduring architectural heritage. Despite the overwhelming dominance of the Ottoman Empire in the region, the Byzantines had left behind an indelible legacy that continued to shape the trajectory of history long after the city fell. One of the most enduring legacies of Byzantium was its preservation and transmission of classical knowledge. During the centuries of the Byzantine Empire's decline, scholars in Constantinople and throughout the empire carefully preserved the works of ancient Greek and Roman authors. When the Ottoman Empire took control of Constantinople, it didn't erase this knowledge, it inherited it. The Ottomans, in fact, were deeply influenced by the Byzantine intellectual tradition, particularly in the fields of philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and law. Byzantine scholars had painstakingly copied and translated the works of ancient philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, and Ptolemy. These texts, which had been lost or forgotten in the West, were vital to the Renaissance, which would later emerge in Italy and other parts of Western Europe. In the wake of Constantinople's fall, many Byzantine scholars fled to Italy, bringing with them priceless manuscripts and knowledge of Greek and Roman thought. These scholars helped spark the intellectual revival of the Renaissance, where classical ideas were rediscovered and reinterpreted. In this sense, the fall of Constantinople, though a tragic moment for the Byzantine Empire, indirectly contributed to the flourishing of European thought in the 15th and 16th centuries. Similarly, the Byzantine legal system lived on through the Ottoman Empire, as well as through its influence on the development of modern European law. Justinian's Corpus Juris Civili, body of civil law, compiled in the 6th century, was one of the most important legal texts in history. Though it had initially been developed for the needs of the Byzantine Empire, it became a foundational source of law in many parts of Europe, especially during the Renaissance. The Ottomans, inheriting much of the Byzantine legal tradition, adapted Justinian's laws to fit their own system, ensuring that the core principles of Byzantine law continued to impact the region for centuries. However, perhaps the most powerful and visible legacy of the Byzantine Empire is its religious influence. The Eastern Orthodox Church, which had been a central pillar of Byzantine life, continued to thrive long after the fall of Constantinople. Though the Ottomans converted many churches into mosques and restricted the influence of Christianity in their empire, they still allowed the Orthodox Christian community to practice their faith under the leadership of the Patriarch of Constantinople. The Patriarchate, once a political arm of the Byzantine Empire, continued to serve as a spiritual and cultural leader for Orthodox Christians. The concept of the Third Rome, which had emerged after the fall of Constantinople, became a central part of Russian identity. Following the fall of Constantinople, Moscow began to see itself as the new center of Orthodox Christianity, a place where the legacy of Byzantium would live on. Tsar Ivan III of Russia married the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, and his successors adopted the title Tsar, derived from Caesar, signaling their claim to be the heirs of the Roman and Byzantine emperors. The Russian Orthodox Church, which had been influenced by Byzantine practices and theology, became a powerful institution in its own right, and Russia would continue to be the heart of Eastern Orthodoxy for centuries. Meanwhile, the physical and cultural legacy of Byzantium endured in the very architecture of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, who had long been admirers of Byzantine architecture, continued to build monumental mosques, palaces, and public buildings that were influenced by the designs of the Hagia Sophia and other Byzantine structures. The famous architect Mimar Sinan, who designed many of the most iconic Ottoman buildings, drew inspiration from the architectural genius of the Byzantines. The mosques of Istanbul, such as the Süleymaniye Mosque, are prime examples of the blend of Byzantine and Ottoman architectural styles, incorporating domes, arches, and intricate mosaics reminiscent of the Byzantine structures that once stood at the heart of the empire. In addition to architecture, the Ottomans inherited the Byzantine tradition of court culture. where art, literature, and intellectual discourse flourished under imperial patronage. The Ottomans, like their Byzantine predecessors, placed a strong emphasis on preserving and nurturing culture. The art of calligraphy, which had been perfected in the Byzantine Empire, became a defining feature of Ottoman art. Byzantine influences can also be seen in Ottoman textiles, pottery, and manuscripts, which blended classical Byzantine styles with Ottoman innovations. The complex relationship between the Byzantine and Ottoman empires was not one of simple conquest and assimilation. While the Ottomans certainly transformed the region, they also absorbed many aspects of Byzantine culture and governance. In this sense, the Ottoman Empire can be seen as both the successor and the inheritor of the Byzantine legacy, continuing some of the cultural, legal, and intellectual traditions of the Byzantine Empire, while adding their own distinct contribution. But even as the Byzantine Empire's physical and political influence faded into the past, its legacy remained alive in the hearts and minds of those who remembered it. In the centuries following the fall of Constantinople, Europeans and Ottomans alike continued to look to Byzantium as a model of civilization, learning, and artistic achievement. The Byzantines were admired for their preservation of classical knowledge, their architectural innovations, and their unique brand of Christian theology. And though the empire itself was no longer there to defend its own greatness, the idea of Byzantium continued to inspire, both in the East and the West. In modern times, historians and scholars have come to recognize Byzantium as a key link between the ancient and medieval worlds. While the empire's decline is often seen as a tragic end to an era, its enduring legacy reminds us that the influence of a civilization is not always measured by its political or military power. Sometimes it is the quiet persistence of culture, faith, and intellectual achievement that leaves the most lasting impact. The story of the Byzantine Empire, its rise, its struggles, and its eventual fall teaches us that no civilization is ever truly gone. Even when an empire falls, its influence lives on in unexpected ways. For the Byzantines, their greatest contribution was not in their conquests, but in their ability to preserve and transmit the knowledge of the ancient world. The Byzantines were not just the last heirs of Rome, they were the bridge between the ancient world and the modern era, and their legacy continues to shape the world we live in today.